China is one of the oldest continuing civilizations in written history. They have one of the deepest and long-lasting cultures in the world, and over time, their economy has grown and changed dramatically. The population grew from 552 million in 1950 to over 1.4 billion today. Urbanization has become a common theme for the growing country.
After World War II, a power vacuum formed. As Japan threatened war, and another group pressured Chinese nationalists, I can't quite remember the Oh yeah, communists. And conflict, the communist invaders started the Long March in 1934, overthrowing the scattered nationalist powers and declaring Mao Zedong as the chairman. Despite all of this, before the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, came to complete power, there was a brief and critical alliance between the CCP and the nationalists to push out Japanese forces. The Communist Party was victorious, and the Republic of China was exiled to what is now Taiwan. One of the most important ideologies of communism includes having a bigger and more powerful government. They have a lot more control over the economy, and all land is owned collectively. An individual cannot own any property. As the population grew, the government began to influence the movement of people from rural farming to urbanization and city workers. They have a lot more control over the economy, and all land is owned collectively. An individual cannot own any property. As the population grew, the government began to influence the movement of people from rural farming to urbanization and city workers.
China's population has been growing very rapidly. It has grown about a third in the last 3 decades. The population went from 1 billion in 1982 to over 1.4 billion today. Because of this, China has been encouraging the growth of the economy through reform of housing market and increased urban residential space. Once the Communist Party came to power, the first political leader, Mao Zedong, began to exploit the influence he had as the person controlling all of the government. Through this authority, he began to push into urbanization, the famous Great Leap Forward in 1957, which was one of the most unsuccessful political campaigns in history. Mao's rushed decisions starved 45 million people, and it is considered the deadliest famine in history. This was an important turning point for the CCP due to the significant changes in the governmental system after Mao's political failures. Since then, China has strengthened its governmental system while continuing to move away from agricultural economy. As the country industrializes, they have been using different methods to begin urbanizing and growing as an economic superpower. As cities continue to grow, many civilians suffer from the problems that are created through rapid urbanization. In more recent years, housing prices have increased so much that they are becoming larger than civilian incomes. Not only that, but pollution and poverty have become prominent as well. The consistent transition from rural villages to modern cities is a bigger challenge for both individuals and for the country as a whole. China faces two very big challenges in the housing market. The first of which would be the migration of people from rural to urban areas. The projected 15 million people would be migrating into cities every year, making the availability of housing to be a continuing issue. As intended by the government, these immigrants mean more workers for the cities, yet ironically, not all of them have the skills needed to make a living, and therefore don't have jobs. Some have to receive money from their children just to survive. The second would be the effect of the new housing market reform policies. Much of the commercial housing has become privatized since 1988. The prices have skyrocketed, as living space per person increase as well. Due to all the rapid rise in cost, some modern residential areas became ghost towns due to the majority of people not being able to afford the expensive apartments and condos. All of these changes in the housing system have made it significantly harder for people to find housing, making it just as hard to stay financially stable. The Chinese Communist Party forced urbanization through possession of housing and death threats. They would claim that they needed land for expansion, when in reality, they wanted to move everyone to cities to increase the number of workers in the urban population. In 1950, 13% of 552 million people in China lived in cities. By 2010, the urban share of the population had increased to 45% out of 1.3 billion. It is projected to reach 60% by 2030. As said before, the intention of forced urbanization is so that China can become a more prosperous country and increase the country's wealth. To some degree, it is working, but it is putting most of the people who transfer from rural to urban areas in worse situations. The government uses many unethical ways to get people to move. One victim of this forced migration says,
They hired jobless guys and thugs. They climbed over my wall and into my yard. They ripped the keys away from my belt and opened the inside of my house door. They dragged me away and lifted my wife out. Then they drove an excavator in and destroyed my house.
Forcing him to leave his neighbors and town he knew well to go live in the house the government gave to him and find a new job in the city. Another victim of forced migration says they were forced to sign contracts that they weren't allowed to see, and they were promised many compensations but never received any of them. Victims of this became broke because the government would lie to people to get them to move to urban areas. Stated by another victim of poverty,
They don't have the resources to live a normal life. Their city skills as farmers don't help them bring in money.
they were given many things, such as housing in the city and money compensations, but they say that they don't always receive what they were promised. Even after they moved, they don't have the resources or skills to be successful. Some have to resort to income from their children just so they can live their lives. Although the new industries and technologies created through rapid urbanization benefit the Chinese economy, pollution is becoming more than just a complication. China has primarily used fossil fuels to power its electrical grid, causing an increase in pollution from decades of coal power generation. Despite the ban on coal-fired power plants in 2016, just 2 years later, the ban was lifted and the construction of fossil fuel power plants continued. Not only this, but as steel and concrete production rises, the power demand grows just as fast. This encourages even more coal generators to be built. To top it all off, the number of vehicles on the road has increased by more than tenfold, from 27 million in 2004 to 390 million in September of 2021. The levels of air pollution are so great that CNN has decided to name it the Airpocalypse, a fitting name for such a dilemma. China is one of the greatest contributors of greenhouse gases, along with other forms of pollution, such as water scarcity and contaminated soil that remain a threat to wealth of China's citizens. The Chinese government believes that by increasing the population in urban areas, they increase the wealth of the city and increase productivity. If you notice, most things we own come from China, and that is what mostly makes China so prosperous. The way China is encouraging people to move to urban areas is horrible, and to most of us, it is morally incorrect. The accelerated expansion of the Chinese industry has caused a lot of unintended consequences. These negative effects are still an ongoing problem for civilians in China. Some ways that could help to shorten the effects of urbanization would be to give people time to move, provide people with options for work, repair the inflated housing market, and develop climate-friendly power solutions. The CCP has been pushing people out of their houses without any notice and any options for money in the city. If the government would allow people to see the contracts and make the people understand what is going on, then they would be able to prepare for moving without being forced to. If more options were given for Chinese immigrants in the field of work, when they moved, they would be able to make a steady income to profit off of. They wouldn't need to rely on the government and their children to survive. Both of these options would allow moving for Chinese immigrants easier and help them be more productive. As stated before, the price-to-income ratio is so high in some cities that they become ghost towns. If the government would lower the price of housing or slow down the adjustments to the housing market, it would make housing more affordable to new citizens. And the new citizens would be able to buy housing, making vacant cities full of people. The government could also take into account what the rural population wants by creating an organization to function as a voice for the poor. The organization would both help without housing issue and the property that the immigrants have to deal with. The government could also take into account what the rural population wants by creating an organization to function as a voice for the poor. This organization would both help with the housing issue and the poverty that the immigrants have to deal with. Moving hundreds of thousands of people every year makes the pollution extremely high in cities, and it is both bad for the environment and the people. Because of rapid urbanization, China faces many different forms of pollution. They have to fight against severe scarcity, high levels of air pollution, and soil contamination.